with us. I would like to thank you, our participants, audiences, the staff, speakers, the friends of the Atlantic Dialogue community for your commitment and continuous engagement with this adventure, which has been a 10-year adventure now. I think institutions to be built needs time and need to sustain the test of time. And 10 years is a test. Of course, it's by any standard not so long at the scale of history, but still a test for a conference. So many thanks to all of you for your energy, your commitment, your time, your dedication to this project. This is highly valued, and let us hope very soon we'll get together on our traditional meeting by the end of the year in Marrakesh. I wanted to say a couple of words about the structure of the meeting this year, but also on the spirit, the content, and where we are, us here in Morocco, but also the Atlantic community on the basis of the discussions we've been having with you. The first is on the structure. This year, we'll have 20 webinars, 2 to 3 per month until December the 18th. More than 90 speakers, and we'd like to thank them again for being with us and having accepted to contribute, and to amount to about 30 nationalities. So I think this diversity is one of the assets and one of the value that we all share, giving space to as many countries as possible of the community, but also as well as a good balance between gender and generations. The second point I wanted to share is about the New South, the values, Africa, what makes us at the Policy Center and why we've been carrying on with the Atlantic Dialogue. I think even more today, what we stand for, fact-based analytics, empirical work, one foot in academia, one foot in applied in practice is an experience, and the mixture of you, our speakers and audiences, the mixture of backgrounds coming from academia, from science, but also having great experience in positions, in applied work, is of high value. And I think it's even high value when we mix this, across the Atlantic with our spirit, which is again, openness and value of tolerance and dialogue. And I think this is even more important in those times to intensify this kind of exchanges. How we see things, maybe share with you a couple of ideas. The recovery is on its way here in Morocco. We have been, rebounding in terms of economy after having after the economic cost of the lockdown. We were losing basically 3 percentage points of GDP per month of lockdown, which is quite high. But since then, we have been recovering. Vaccination has been quite astounding, with numbers that are close to those of advanced economies in terms of vaccination. Morocco is leading the way in Africa. Recovering is on the way, but at the same time, all around the world, we see that there are various layers of this crisis. It's of course a challenge for short-term macroeconomic policy, but it is also revealing in a way long-term structural challenges with profound changes and durable effects over the long run. And let's not be mistaken, this is not, just a sort of accident or, of a sort of a very short-term phenomena. They are very serious long-term challenges for our communities. Let me quote list a few of those. I mean, they are in terms of, and they will all be covered by our various panels across the next the next 10 weeks. Basically, of course, there's the rivalry, the change in international affairs, the change of the status of international law, the challenges to multilateralism. It's a whole bundle with an increase and rivalry between US and China, but not only, because also competition between middle sort of size powers, let's say on Africa and the Atlantic in general, which are sort of profoundly changing the landscape and changing also traditions. And these issues are not only affecting us on the southern part of the Atlantic, but they're also, as we have seen with the submarine crisis, affecting also the traditional transatlantic partners. So there is another one which is even, I would say, I should have started with it. It's climate and its consequences, and the fact that in general and on average, we have not been very serious about climate. I don't have time here to give numbers, but you're all well aware of the challenges of the energy transition, but climate in general is posing humongous challenges to our communities all across the Atlantic. Inequality and the demand for a renewed state, a renewed social state, demand for protection from citizens all around, the capacity of our state to deliver an efficient response to the COVID crisis has sort of been one of the determinants on how the crisis has affected populations. Just simply the performance of the state, its capacity to deliver vaccination, health services, etc., is one of the challenges, and linked to, of course, inequality, and we are not all equals in front of the pandemic, in terms of health risks, personal risks in life, etc. And I think, in a way, this is the social state is back, or needs to be reinvented after what we had, since 1945, and the kind of states we had. It's still to be reinvented. Another one is, of course, education and the way we organize education, the way how we educate our population for the 21st century at the digital age, humongous challenges for education, our educational systems. Linked to that is, of course, innovation, research and development, which is a the fundamental driver for economic growth and prosperity, innovation, and very tightly linked to the education and innovation and research system in countries. And I think that we all share this challenge around the Atlantic, reinventing our educational system for the 21st century. So these are a couple of examples of long-term reforms that are needed, that will have, of course, that are structural by essence, and that will transform our societies. In the short run, there is an entanglement of issues and a very complex macroeconomic policies that have to be put in places in effect by countries, and of course, after the huge public stimulus and increased fiscal deficit and debt, public debt in many countries, the time has now turned to an adjustment, while we need to finance the structural long-term reforms I was talking about. So there's a sort of very complex balancing act that has to be played by policymakers. So and the same goes for the money, of course, the monetary policy and the fiscal policy in the short run. So despite recoveries on the way, there is still several serious issues in terms of monetary and fiscal policy. We don't have time to get into here. So I see this time where we meet for this Atlantic dialogue toward the end of the year a sort of critical junctures where we have those short-term challenges to public policy and macroeconomic policies, also the longer run and long-term effect and much deeper reforms that have to be made. All that has to be done in a sort of a framework where we need to increase resilience, where we need to keep our internal fronts, domestically together. Of course, not easy as the polarization of public political scenes in many countries is as high as it has been over the past 50 years, maybe. And so I don't want to sound too gloomy, but I would say challenging times, complexity, but also interest for us as researchers, as practitioners with a passion for academia at the nexus of academia, public policies, but also civil society. So I think we have a role to play, to be a platform for ideas, innovation, creativity, and that is what we stand for at the Policy Center, and also what the Atlantic Dialogues are standing for. And I think it's also a special place that Morocco has, in the global scene and in Africa, and place where people meet, where people have the space to create, the space to be innovative, the space to just speak their mind. And I think these are very, very important value we need, of course, to protect. So again, just to conclude, thank you very much from us here in Rabat, and really looking forward to see you in person very soon. Enjoy the Atlantic Dialogue. This is your conference, this is your space. There will be lots of debate, and also we make sure that there is space for audiences to ask questions and to interact with panels. So again, my best to all of you, and we'll be seeing you and contributing with you over the upcoming 10 weeks. So many thanks again.
Okay, good afternoon and panel of the 10th edition of the Atlantic Dialogues. This first conversation explores the challenge of pandemics. It's a pleasure to be your moderator. My name is Udwa Kamimo. We are still in a time of pandemic. It's been a time of grief and hardship for quite a few of us, so I'm grateful to be with old friends from the Atlantic Dialogues community and to find you all in good health. This conversation is taking place virtually. We're live streaming on Facebook and YouTube, which we are all familiar with, but I will go through some housekeeping. There will be time to comment and ask questions, and these you can do through Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and I'll work them into the conversation as we go along. As is the standard with Atlantic Dialogues, the lineup of speakers is incredibly insightful and rich. Let me introduce them, starting with Obi Ezekwesili. She's a former Minister of Education, Senior Economic Advisor, the Africa Economic Development Policy Initiative in Nigeria. And from Spain, we have Ana Palacio, member of the Council of State and former Foreign Minister. From Portugal, we have Paulo Portas, former Deputy Prime Minister and former Foreign Minister. And last but not least, from France, we have Hubert Védrine, who's a former Foreign Minister. Welcome to you all. Now, the general consensus is that the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic has been a dismal failure. And its latest report, the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, the GPMB, said these failures were rooted in inequality, inaction, and exacerbated by geopolitical division. I don't think any of you speakers will disagree with that verdict. So what we will do over the course of the next hour or so that we have is to figure out how to fix that going forward through the prism of governance. And so my first question, and I'll start with you, Obi, and work our way into Europe, is what role do you think governance, whether good or bad, has played in the failures we see?
Well, I suppose that it is important to nuance, that broad brush of global failure, and to isolate the fact that when it came to the matter of managing the pandemic, that interestingly, Africa seemed to have done slightly better than the rest of the world on this particular occasion. The responsiveness that we saw across the continent was quite, interesting to behold. And I think that a lot of it came from, overreaction to the fact that the world, and I think it's good overreaction really, to the fact that the world was saying that if this came into Africa, it was going to kill every one of us. And so suddenly our political elite that would normally not care about matters that are that important found that they also were, likely candidates. And so I think all machinery came into full force. And so we saw that at the AU, interestingly, through the Africa Center for Disease Control, really, took up leadership on this. Ministers of health immediately were meeting together. Presidents were out there communicating to citizens. There was a whole machinery that was in full force at work. And then the second part of it was that Africa recognizing that how many intensive care units do you have on the continent? I don't think we have up to 2 beyond South Africa and perhaps Egypt. The other countries really don't have that kind of quality of intensive care units. So the weight had to be on prevention. So every protocol that could reduce incident of contact, incident of contraction of the infection was put into play. And the citizens were also interested as much as possible in abiding. In some cases, of course, where they did not abide, you had authoritarian kind of reaction that was also not right. So I would isolate that and then look at a broader perspective and say that what we saw was a classic failure of an already wobbly multilateral system, right? So our multilateral order has been creaking all this while, and everybody has pretended that we're fine, but COVID showed us not to be fine at all. And so hopefully this would be the opportunity that we finally have to think and redesign, completely, design a new multilateral order, a new multilateral system that, that functions on, that's anchored on equitable representation, inclusive representation, the kind of multilateral order that is designed to foster mutuality of interests of all countries and not for some countries. Because as COVID has shown, we are as strong as the weakest amongst us. So the weakest amongst us can be our undoing. And so we would be very, very I don't even know how to characterize it. We wouldn't be wise to ignore the weakest amongst us in a new multilateral design for how we would manage global public bads, like what we've just seen. The COVID is a classic case of a global public bad, and we don't have the mechanisms for dealing with it. Look at what happened in Europe. Even with the European Union, you suddenly saw all countries just, reduced to national, I got to take care of my people. Meanwhile, COVID was saying to us, I'm a global problem. I'm a global problem. You can't erect a wall against me, So we've got to, we really have some conversations to make on the global governance.
And since you've ushered us.
Rounding up with Africa again, I have to say that, look, COVID or the good management or poor management of it does not remove the fact that we are a continent that has the greatest obstacle of poor governance to growth, right? Poor governance is what limits our capacity to translate all the opportunities we have, whether it's in terms of our population or it's in terms of our blessings with natural resources endowment. Poor governance stands in the way of our capacity to translate all of that to growth and to development and to inclusive prosperity of our people. And that's woeful. And it's something that we must now pay attention to, because the 21st century cannot afford to see Africa still struggling with the same existential problems that we have carried with us into it.
Okay, well, you've gotten us off to a rousing start, Obi. And since you talked about the European experience, Anna, I'll come to you just to give us an overview of the European experience as we've. Anna, you're muted. Please unmute.
Well, first of all, even if time is a scarce commodity, thank you. Thank you for your moderation, and thank you for the center for inviting me to this interesting panel. We are three Europeans for this European experience. So allow me first to say just three concepts to anchor this debate. I think that the COVID has been first a turning point. There will be a before and an after in many areas, not just in the way we work, in the way we relate. Second, it is a prototype, and I will come back to it. It's a prototype. It's the first of a kind, and there will be others. But just, Paulo Portas was in government when SARS-1 happened in the beginning of the 2000s. And we expected it to hit us, and it did not. And we prepared, and it did not. And this time we were not prepared. We will come back to that. And then finally, I think that it is a revelator of currents that were there, and this has pushed them forward. First, one data comparing with Africa, Latin America. Because there is no Latin America, and I will say that Latin America is performing poorly, and nobody understands this gap between the way Africa has performed and the way Latin America, with 8% of the population, 30% of deaths, losing GDP by 9%, so it's huge. And this has a special incidence in Brazil. I know that Paulo wants to speak about populisms, so I will leave it. I will leave it there, because populism is one of the. COVID has been a revelator for populism. We found that from Bolsonaro to Trump to Orban, there were certain commonalities on how populist leaders just confronted COVID in a kind of boasting way, just like Putin as well. And I will leave it there, because you have asked us to be very short. But when I say that it has been a revelator of currents, I mean power. Power is what it was before. The only thing is that we have understood better where China is, where China diplomacy is, where China's domination or infiltration in multilateral institutions is. And I say all this deserves that we go back to it. But my point here is expectations. I think that first and foremost, the COVID has been a revelator of the expectations that middle classes all over the world place on multilateral institutions, and as Obi very well said, what multilateral institutions can deliver. So multilateral institutions were weak. WHO is a case in point, and we have come to understand how weak they are. And you speak about redesign. I would be very cautious on just not creating a bigger gap between expectations and what we can deliver for the future. In my opinion, what we have to address is we have to make citizens all over the world and informed citizens understand this gap and understand that if they want strong multilateral institutions, they have to push for that. And today, blaming and shaming the strength of public opinion counts and counts a lot. They cannot take it for granted that WHO will deliver. I finish on the European Union. In the European Union, we discovered when the COVID was upon us that the European Union had no competencies whatsoever, and that there were there were sick people that could not be transferred, and that the frontiers were closed, and that you kept your respirators or your mask for yourself, you meaning Spanish, French, or whoever. So each man for himself. This was exactly the negation of the European Union. I must say, and this is good news, is that the European Union reacted and we put in place a common approach without a legal basis, which means, again, if there is political will, you find a way to go forward. What we don't have today in real terms is a political will to strengthen our multilateral institutions, and I will leave it there. I just met your requirements of time.
No, there's a lot to unpack. It's an interesting conversation that's unfolding. And so the French experience, because I know, of course, you've set us up, for the descent of the European Union into nationalistic, self-protecting mechanisms. Hubert, from OB, we've heard that even though Africa tends to find itself awash with examples of poor governance, Africa contradicts the expected narrative by performing better than Europe in terms of how it approaches the crisis. From where you sit, what would you make of the role of governance in the way that COVID has been handled across the world? And you're speaking French, so I need interpretation.
C'est à moi de parler.
Yes.
Are you ready?
Please continue. Please
okay.
Continue. Thank you.
L'interprète m'entend? Allô? Bon, je parle en français, vous me direz si ça fonctionne. OK? D'abord, je félicite.
First of all, I'd like to congratulate our think tank for organizing this event and this meeting. Secondly, I don't think we can talk about a failure of governance. It seems to me a little exaggerated and premature. Some countries have reacted more than others or better than others for a range of reasons. In Africa, in Southeast Asia, because they have drawn better lessons of previous outbreaks like SRAS and Ebola, and for demographic reasons and for other reasons. But we cannot talk about a global failure here. Therefore, our rationale should not, to my mind, stem from this first conclusion. And I'd like to go to another question that is almost a conclusion. And I think in this regard that the whole world needs a systematic assessment, but it's still too soon and too early. It's good to talk about it, to start thinking about it, but maybe we should do it next year, a systematic assessment of vigilance, of alert, of information sharing, of cooperation, of precaution measures, distancing and social distancing measures, in other words, lockdown and different forms of confinements, first, second, and third times, of level of authority in the enforcement and implementation of confinement measures. It's easier in some political regimes and in others where it's almost impossible. It depends on the way of lives. The vaccine campaigns related to research, discovery, implementation, cooperation. So there are a range of assessments to be carried out. And for me, our discussion is only but an early step before the systematic assessment. Why am I insisting on this? Because there were different distinct opinions on COVID, but for virologists, there are no divergences. I'm not talking about doctors in general, but virologists, specialists of viruses. And they kept telling us for years that a great breathing pandemic was expectable and that will appear and break out in some very populated areas, in some parts of the world where forests are destroyed, where viruses can actually be liberated and deconfined. And of course, there are promiscuities in very populated areas. And then viruses will actually circulate with this great mobility and permanent mobility and density of people, like Bornean movements. So virologists have been telling us for years that this will happen one day. We could have drawn the lessons prematurely and early and have like an early warning, but we would have had to change the lifestyle of billions of people. But now we can draw the lessons. And as our virologists are telling us that this will happen again, that there will be other pandemics and breakouts, really pledging for this global assessment. And we are starting to do this through our exchanges and dialogue. But I'm talking, and I mean by that, systematic assessments in the management of the pandemic. So in some cases, this management was very good. In some other countries, it was very bad. And in most cases, it was contradictory, and no country had the same policy from the very beginning into the end. There were a lot of changes happening for efficiency reasons, for public opinion reasons, etc. So who's going to be conducting these kind of assessments? We can say theoretically and in a very abstract manner in the discourse on multilateralism, very nice and fancy discourses, but not very effective. We can say it will be the World Health Organization that will be doing this assessment, but it has shown its limitations. So I see it as an umbrella, as a holding, as a hat in this whole process. But we need to continue exerting pressure on all world governments with very simple questions that I've listed earlier on chronology of the pandemics, what it is that we have done on such a such step, what are the lessons that you have drawn, what are your proposals? And as this is not enough, I have the feeling that this think tank or other think tank could take the lead with 20 other leading think tanks around the world, and the condition is that they will be good, well and balanced, well, rightly scattered around continents, around Africa, Europe, and Asia. So we need to actually have around this multilateral organizations and governments to come up with methodological lessons. And of course, it's roughly easier to apply the recommendations according to the regimes, etc. But at least we need like a common program, as this is the first time ever that the whole humanity with different rhythms and speeds is facing the same threat, and this really risks repeating itself. And I think we're not going to wait for governments to react, because this is a think tank that has been growing and is really taking the lead and really having a great momentum. Right. So we could take that initiative. So these are my ideas. Thank you.
Yes, I was listening to the translation. Thank you very much. And so, Paulo, there's much in that response, but I really would like to hear from you what you think about the role of governance in how we, in how the world approached COVID.
Thank you very much. Thank you to LCP Think Tank. Je parlerai en français parce que c'est la langue que j'utilise plus fréquemment au Maroc.
speak French. This is my common language that I regularly speak in Morocco. So I'd like to pay tribute not only to the panelists, but also, more importantly, Anna and Hubert, because we're faced with the same challenges, difficulties, and anxieties, and that strong eagerness to transform the government's tasks in the policy making. So to answer your key questions, I would say the following. In the first place, there are very little governments who have soundly and well managed the pandemic. But yeah, there are some governments in Asia that did better. So we should say this with clarity and say it out loud. So countries like South Korea, Taiwan, and even Singapore have had a better performance of the COVID management, and they were humanitarian. It was a humanitarian approach because they've saved lives. And I'm calling here for a lesson to be drawn from this pandemic. Countries that have better managed COVID are those who've had that pandemic memory of SARS and MERS viruses and who have changed some legal provisions and regulations and even constitutional regulations of their own countries to face the next pandemic. It's actually the pandemic memory, the experience, and also the idea that Anna and Hubert have clearly highlighted, the idea that there are lessons learned here to face the next pandemic. And I'm saying the next one after COVID-19, because we do know that this was not the first global crisis and will certainly not be the last. If the next is a climatic or technological, we don't know. But let's acknowledge this principle and recognize this principle. Those who have pandemic memory have had a better performance. And in particular, those who know very well China, its cultural rules, on its food regulations and rules where it all started. So that's the first point, the pandemic memory. And I very, very much hope and truly hope that we will be drawing lessons of what happened and what went wrong for the next one. Second thing I would like to outscore is that a pandemic is a complex phenomenon and reasonably distant from the knowledge that political players and actors have, because political players and policymakers are not virologists, are not pharmacists. It was not an usual issue for political decision makers. But there's a key out there to decide better, and that is to accept the need and the limitations of the relationship between politics and science. Those who have accepted have better managed and who have better managed the relationship between science and its limitations and the politics and its needs have had a better performance. It seems to me absolutely crystal clear that in Europe there was one single political Europe, a woman who comes from a scientific background and who has shown prudence and reason and has been very reasonable in managing the crisis, even if the results that really has shown very interesting result in terms of pandemic management. So, and that is Angela Merkel. She can understand the scientific methods and language because she has the scientific and political background. When politicians ask virologists, when can I open schools? they will not probably have a very clear answer and response. So over the months and months on this pandemic wave, we've had an uncertain relationship, but yet vital relationship between politics and science. And if I may go into the my third point, populism is always a simplification. Populists believe in miracle recipes in a tweet.
Ranking particulier. Si vous voyez les 15 pires cas du monde en matière de contagions et fatalities, 12 des 15 sont des gouvernements populistes de gauche ou de droite. Donc, il y a beaucoup de gouvernements démocratiques et modérés qui ont fait une mauvaise gestion. Il y a quelques gouvernements autoritaires ou démocratiques en Asie ou en Allemagne qui ont fait une gestion plus professionnelle, mais je ne connais un seul gouvernement populiste qui a été capable de faire une gestion minimalement décente de la pandémie. C'est pour moi une autre... Et finalement, je veux souligner qu'on n'a pas seulement... c'est très décisif. Il faut ajouter un point. Ce n'est pas... on a dû faire face au... we had to manage the unknown. Ce qui n'est pas connu n'a pas de manuel ou de recette écrite. On n'a pas une politique définie à la préalable pour faire face au to the unknown. Okay? Et les gouvernements ont dû faire face donc à deux choses. La première, une pandémie largement méconnue dans ses détails. Il y avait d'autres au passé et cette mémoire a été utile. Et en même temps, les gouvernements ont dû faire face à l'ignorance comme argument d'autorité. Le monde a beaucoup changé et la so-called démocratie digitale, c'est une explosion d'ignorance, d'insultes, de théories conspirationnistes, de théories destructives. Et les gouvernements ont dû faire face d'un côté à ce qu'on ne savait pas et d'autre côté à ce que les gens des réseaux sociaux proclament que savent sans aucune preuve. Et voyez l'exemple des États-Unis. Ils ont été les grands vainqueurs parce qu'ils ont financé le research and development des vaccins. Ils ont fait 6 mois de vaccination magnifique et après, ils sont incapables de vacciner 40% de la population parce qu'ils sont des négationnistes ou des conspirationnistes. Donc, en même temps, managing the unknown et managing ignorance. C'est très difficile. Ma seule et dernière parole pour reprendre ce qu'Hubert a dit. On n'a pas un système international de gestion de crise dans le monde actuel. Et le Covid a été révélateur, comme a dit Anna, de cette faiblesse, soit au niveau continental, soit au niveau planétaire. Voyez les institutions internationales qui ont été relevantes dans cette gestion. Très peu et limité.
Okay. So, you know, there seems to be consensus about the...
Il semble qu'il y ait un consensus des échecs ou des défaillances au niveau du système multilatéral et l'impossibilité de répondre à une crise à mesure qu'elle émerge. Mais si nous devions quantifier les conséquences dévastatrices de la pandémie de la Covid, et il y a des estimations que d'ici...
Vaccine hoarding. There were protests in Italy this weekend during the G20 summit about that. We've seen livelihoods lost. How then can multilateralism, you know, strengthened international cooperation, good governance? If I were to throw this to you, Obi, how then can good governance mitigate such devastating consequences? Please unmute. Obi, please unmute. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Uduak. It was great to listen to my European co-panelists make contributions to this conversation, and that was quite helpful. I think that on good governance, we have to start from the domestic before going to the multilateral. And for our continent, it's absolutely important that we should be able to govern our domestic space, or spaces as the case may be, ensuring that those characteristics of good governance that we all know, whether they be effectiveness of governance or equity in governance or transparency, accountability, inclusion, and all of the things that go with that, basically leading to governance that delivers results for the people. It is really about how effectively our country is being governed by those who constitute the political authority of the countries, to ensure that we're not continuing to deal with the same challenges as we dealt with in the previous century. So the first thing for me is how well Africa realizes that, am I still on? It seemed like I had an interruption. Okay, so how well is Africa ready to imagine a new world? People are talking about recovery, but Africa should be in a place of reimagining. You know, we can't just say we would carry on from where we were when COVID struck. No, we don't have that luxury on our continent. So perhaps this is the opportunity that we need a kind of bold leadership, bold political leadership that gets back to the table and imagines a different world, a different pathway for our continent. So number one thing would be a diagnostics as to the areas that we have failed in. We have failed to translate our opportunities to growth. What is it that has stood in the way of that? We know that very bad policies have curtailed our growth. So when you look across the continent, sectors where we have managed to do the right kinds of policies that are market friendly, for example, technology, ICT, telecom, we have seen that growth is possible. And suddenly we find that technology, the ICT, telecom, is adding some 6% to our GDP as a continent. Why? Because we embraced market principles and we basically reformed that sector. We liberalized and enabled that sector to get the opportunities that market incentives offer for competitiveness, for real, value for money. And so what are the other sectors that are lying dormant and in the stranglehold of governance, in the stranglehold of leaders who want to control everything and end up messing up everything? We need to just think of our economy differently entirely and remove as much as possible the incompetent hands of government from the things that could create opportunities for growth. And why is that important? It's important because, look, we end up with 20 million young people in the labor market every year. Our economies are not expanding as rapidly enough as possible to absorb them. So we can't go on a tepid recovery journey like every other continent. We are in a hurry to just get ourselves on a different trajectory from where we were before COVID. So economic governance has to completely and entirely change in the way that we approach it. The second part of it is that we need to think in terms of what COVID revealed. COVID revealed that it was unwise for our whole world to basically create by ourselves a monopoly situation for production. we basically all abdicated responsibility in the guise of competitiveness, and some of the countries in Europe, most of Europe and America decided, oh, they are operating at top-end services, and so manufacturing is passe, and we ended up with a monopoly, a production system where everybody was looking to China for the busiest of things during a pandemic. So now we realize that this kind of a monopoly control of manufacturing is not helpful to the world. So it means that there is really an opportunity for our continent. And that opportunity is even more translated if we would walk the talk of the Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement, right? So a continental free trade agreement, because if we can now remove the barriers to foreign direct investment as well as domestic investment, we would see a lot of production activities begin to happen on our continent. So we could be beneficiaries of what has been revealed in the COVID period, because for us, it is, while we were not dealing with so much of life-threatened situation, we were dealing with livelihood shut down. And that shutdown of livelihoods can ultimately, in the long term, be life-threatening. So we must be in a hurry to get real production going on our continent. The era of being comfortable with rent that comes from oil, from copper, from gold, it should be over. Post-COVID Africa must be an Africa that is designing a pathway for manufacturing. We cannot but engage in attracting the investments that would lead to manufacturing, jobs that come from it. The third part of it is that COVID showed us how important technology has become for our continent. Now we need to go the last mile. The last mile in technology means that those who are excluded from the penetration of technology must be included. So it means that public-private partnerships between our governments and the private sector must happen in order to support our, including those in the rural economies. And you know that most of them are the ones in subsistence farming, and that is not the pathway to the kind of growth that we want to see, the kind of poverty reduction that we want to see. So for me, Africa's governance issue is priority domestic, and then secondarily multilateral. So for the domestic one, I have given a sense of direction that we need the right policies, we need the right institutions that function well to create predictability and attraction for foreign direct investment. And then we need good management of our scarce resources. And we fail big time there. The kind of corrupt or very inappropriate use of limited resources, we can't continue that way. Look at us. When others were having fiscal stimulus as huge as 10%, some 15%, we could only do a miserable 1.5% to 2%. Now, that even with that, there's so much that has happened in terms of debt ratcheting up. Now, this debt ratcheting up has its consequences, because now countries are so debt unsustainable. They are not even able to invest in the pro-poor social investments that are important to spur growth. So you look at it all round. We're not coming out of this very well, but governance can make all the difference in the way that we approach it. So that globally, when you have a strong footing domestically, it strengthens your voice for the global conversation. And I think that we must do first thing first, get our domestic policies aligned for the kind of growth, get our environment aligned for the attraction of investment from boardrooms that are going to be wanting to diversify the sources of their production system.
Thank you, Obi. Hubert, I'll come to you to ask, we've just heard about the role good governance could play whether we're talking about multilateralism and how it could mitigate the devastating consequences of COVID. And so when it comes to good governance, Western countries, European countries are typically held up to the rest of us, Africa, Latin America, Asia, as paragons of good governance. And yet we know that, Western countries stockpiled vaccines, that they're currently sitting on more vaccines that they need, crisis, and we balance the two. How do we ensure that we're not at this place again where we're preaching one thing and saying another? And doing another. Sorry, that question was for Hubert. Was it translated? Okay, Hubert,
you hear me? You hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I have not understood well the question. Okay. Could you repeat slowly?
The question is that Western countries, we're talking about good governance, and Western countries are typically held up as paragons of good governance to the rest of us. And yet we know in this COVID experience that Western countries have stockpiled vaccines, they've hoarded them, ensuring that the rest of us are unable to get them. So when we talk about multilateralism, the weaknesses in international collaboration, how do we balance the idea that good governance helps, but when we see the countries that are supposedly great at governance, they are not necessarily behaving very well?
Je ne peux répondre que par des généralités.
I can only answer by saying general issues and general comments. I cannot talk on behalf of all Western European countries. Let's go back a little. Before the pandemic, no country has really sacrificed public health, and no country has completely sacrificed its economy. So countries have tried to strike a balance between both. It changed several times, of course, during the course of events. Secondly, let's beware and cautious on multilateralism. It's not a miracle solution. Of course, it's much better to cooperate. It's much better to work hand in hand. It would have been better that China would inform everyone earlier. It would have been better to cooperate faster on vaccines. That has been discovered thanks to capitalism, thanks to a huge American liberal capitalism. And vaccines were not actually invented through public funds applied, but of course we can ask a question of how to manage them. Multilateralism, I've done that all my life. We'd better cooperate, but at the end of the day, we have to take the decisions. But even in multilateralism, we have never seen it, or multilateralism imposing decisions to powers that didn't want to. I'm, of course, in favor, but let's not fall in this idealized vision of multilateralism. It's a good method. It's a good cooperation method, but let's say it. It's a very difficult decision to take and to move to concrete decisions. Now, going back to Europe, I echo what Paolo said earlier on. Germany, to me, has better managed this situation or pandemic, because the Germans used to say it was thanks to decentralization, the landers, as you say, but there were some controversies because some landers did not agree with what Mrs. Merkel was saying. But despite all this, she actually managed with her peaceful methodology to reach that consensus. So in a whole, I'm ready to echo and to agree with Paolo, what he said about Germany. And following his mindsets. The only ruler in Europe that had the scientific background was Mrs. Merkel. It is a malicious comment from my side, but when she was a young minister for research under Helmut Kohl, she was in favor of nuclear research. Before the ecologists and environmentalists, she understood that nuclear energy did not issue CO2, but of course, later on, she changed her position to kind of sign an agreement with the environmentalists. Of course, this is not our main topic. So I agree to say what he said on Mrs. Merkel, to highlight the interest of a minimum of cultural background, even if it does not replace a dialogue between experts and the political decision makers. This is as far as Germany goes.
Je pense que l'Union européenne a plutôt bien agi. Je parle des institutions.
Have any particular competences, and it's still not the case because no country in Europe wants the Commission to take its own decisions. Instead, we're not going to be asking a political or European policymaker to shut down or close or open a school, but given the European Commission's competences, it was not bad. In the Green Deal of Mrs. van der Leyen, it's not bad. So I'm rather positive.
Okay.
But let me go back to my earlier comment. No country has globally reacted well. And of course, only Mr. Sauté who had the memory. So we have to create a world pandemic memory. As I was saying, there are a lot of commonalities between what Paolo and Anna were saying, and myself, of course. Thank you so much.
Yes, you will have similar experiences coming from Europe and professional experience.
Merci infiniment pour tous ces
ministers. Anna, I'll come to you. Okay, you want to say something?
No. First, Anna. Je voudrais ajouter deux choses.
Okay.
First, Anna.
You had talked earlier about, the international system collaboration.
Anna?
You gave us an overview of Europe's competence and how you're, the steps you're taking to get yourselves to address the pandemic. But there's a question here about vaccine sovereignty and multilateralism. How is that playing out for you in Europe?
Well, bon, d'abord, comme moi, j'adore parler le français, alors je vais suivre.
So I'm really love speaking French, so I'm going to switch to French, if you don't mind. Well, listen, first and foremost, so Ben Vedrine said it, we are on the same line, on the same, with different points and comments, but they really target the same question. And your question is related to this primordial question that was addressed by my two colleagues and myself in the first comments in a very brief or telegraphic way, because I really believed in your 2-3 minutes time allocation. Well, I think we need to have the necessary information not to fall in the same traps that we have fallen into before, especially in those countries who did not suffer the first SARS crisis and the MERS crisis. So we do need to have the information. And what Hubert Vedrine was saying, it was extremely interesting. So how we go about it and how we actually grow about it, and what is the role that civil society can play, a network of think tanks to really compile all this information, assess it, and use it. Because in Europe, everywhere around the world, we have been struggling. We made the mistake to kind of we made the mistake to maybe want to achieve the global or general collective immunity. That was true in the UK, in some other countries. And we were kind of struggling, moving forward, moving back. But I think that Paulo brought a very interesting idea. You need we need to have trust and confidence in the studies and scientists. And the problem now is that the social media is full of information that are not giving the right information, or this is misinformation or fake information of the conspiracy theory. And this is what we have to look at. What Hubert Védrine was true, but how to go about it to find and to build the trust of the public at large. And this is where, honestly and frankly, despite everything, we have like this World Bank experience. We have to revive multinational or multilateral institutions, because we can blame them for everything in the world. But we do need a conductor that could be would be multilateral. So today, or currently, WHO, that is supposed to do that job, has no prestige, and no one trusts what the WHO has been doing. So on the one side, not giving or sharing the information, and on the other side, showing the dependence they had towards China. So we need to work on the multilateral institutions. I am a realistic person, and I agree with Hubert Védrine. We cannot have this utopic type of idea of multilateral institutions, but we still have to do a lot of work to do on this, and much remains to be done. Of course, China is not going to be sharing the information if they don't want to. And China is going to be taking measures against Australia because Australia has dared to ask what Hubert is preaching for. In other words, an international investigation. And only because of that, they had the drawbacks that they had. Let's be realistic, and I will close with the following. I don't like transparency. Well, transparency is passive and information is active. We need to be proactive, and we need to find back all this information. We need to work hard to have that information sharing, but we also need to manage the expectations. Well, this is what we say in French, expectations, what it is that the situation or the citizens think they can expect from governments and multilateral organizations. And I would like to go back to the very precise question, your precise question. Here we're talking about intellectual property question. Europe said we should guarantee the intellectual property and at the same time guaranteeing access to vaccine. This shouldn't be contradictory. We have mismanaged this, honestly, and we should manage it better. I am in favor of intellectual property, but I'm yet in favor of vaccine sharing and distribution. We didn't do that right. And there is another aspect to this. Even by lifting or removing intellectual property, there are still some manufacturing methods that are not that easy. Therefore, there is a duty upon us. It wasn't well managed, and I must say, I must confess that the EU has been the great provider or leading provider of vaccines in the world after having been caught really at a last minute, being not able to manage our population well. So we could not. So it was a dream, distributing our vaccines outside the country before vaccinating our own population. It was a dream. But there are lessons to be drawn here and procedures and protocols to be followed and implemented. Next time, we will have to manage this kind of pandemic. We need to know how to do things and how to actually implement the whole machinery without, honestly, I'm also, by the way, in favor of nuclear energy. I think that is the huge mistake, is not to realize that we have to be decarbonized but that's another talk we should be having. But let's be realistic. Let's be very realistic on these questions. I'm sorry, I had some time
it's interesting, and it's a very rich panel with very rich insights. Yes.
Udrag, just
okay. On the first issue, I think that again, it's a matter of expectations, it's a matter of information, and it's a matter of really taking the lessons with realism and without utopism, with a role for multilateral institutions. On this, I'm with Obi. We need multilateral institutions.
Okay, you're all agreeing, and there's a thread, another thread that's emerging through this conversation, and Karim introduced it in his opening remarks when he touched on state capacity, inequality, and these calls for a renewed social contract. And this is a question I want to ask you, Paulo. I know you've got something that you want to say, but as you make those remarks, please address the issue of the social contract, a renewed social contract, and what sort of contract, good governance, the sort of governance we're talking about from the lessons we've learned that you've all been putting on the table. What would that contract look like? Thank you.
Seulement encore pour souligner que je crois que l'idée de Hubert,
I think
c'est une très belle idée.
Hubert's idea is a very beautiful idea to maybe start like a think tank coalition in the 5 continents and maybe conduct a rigorous.
Okay, since you're responding to that, I will ask you a question. There's a question from an audience member who says the idea of an evaluation by think tanks is interesting, but to what extent is it feasible when you think about sovereignty, access to data, viability of data for certain regions? Thank you. Please.
If there is no data access, we have to say it, but we have to try it. Parce que dans le monde digital, on vit, la vie est...
In the digital world, life is a succession of emergence, of indignations, of emotions. There is no rationality. We have to make an effort of rationality, of information, and assessment and evaluation of our policies. There are a lot of policies that were implemented. Some were more successful, others were less successful. So we need to conduct a thorough assessments. That was my point. And I'd like to add the following. And I will, of course, answer your question. Just a point of detail on Africa that I know very well and I love so much. Africa is the youngest continent in the world. The average age of an African is 18 years old. The average age of a European is 42, and it's rising and rising and rising. The demographic blindness of Europe from the public policy standpoint has been one of the reasons why the impact of COVID in 2020 in Europe was a disaster, because we are an aging society. Youth are, of course, and unquestionably better protected and more protected than the elderly population. So we should keep this in mind. Of course, the youth of Africa is an asset for Africa, but also a risk. And the second important thing is that Africa has a better and more pandemic memory than Europe. We have experienced other pandemics in Africa that we have not experienced and witnessed in Europe, except from other, people bringing the viruses. And another important thing in this pandemic is what we call, is a very important word, asymmetric pandemic. This pandemic has been global and has never ever been asymmetric. Therefore, for Africa, the question of economic recovery is the most important question here, because of the phenomena that are drawbacks and consequences of the pandemics. But if you add to them remittances, investments, trade, development aid, and international awards and prices of natural resources, we have a perfect match here. As Obi said, I have a lot of hope in the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And I want to add another important thing. It was the best economic news of the year, of the pandemic year, because as we know, we started opening up the effectiveness of the agreement. It really entered into force on the 1st January. This trade agreement with over 40 ratifications. And it is a great opportunity for a continent where the problem of drop of remittances was important, and the drop of prices in 2020, rise of debts, and suspicions of foreign direct investment and development aid have resulted in very difficult economic conditions. This being said, I'd like to highlight a provocative thing vis-a-vis the politically correct. I've heard a lot without seeing any evidence of it, the idea that the global crisis was a crisis of globalization. And I may add a comment, a detail. For economic recovery, we will be needing globalization more than ever, more than before. What is globalization? Open trade, for indirect investments, innovation and technology. Therefore, in order to recover, we're going to be needing, like the World Trade Organization is saying and arguing, in order to achieve 8% of commercial growth this year compared to a drop of last year, we will be needing a repositioning of our providers and logistics chains and channels that have not been settled yet, because this pandemic is asymmetric. No one is closing at the same time or opening up at the same time. So we're going to be witnessing a harsh competition between all countries to sell more, to attract more international foreign direct investment, and in technological progress and innovation progress. This is at the very heart and core of globalization. Of course, globalization has its challenges, but it was a way to mitigate inequalities between North and South. It was the most successful that we have ever experienced in the world. If we return back to a closed world, we're going to be creating more poverty. And we should say this out loud to the populists in the world. They are making the world poorer and poorer. They are actually impovering the world with their kind of logos. What does the world need? Work, sell and buy, and going back to a normal life, even if there are problems. But normally in the concentration of production in Asia, this is something that we could be tackled. But anyway, we're going to be needing globalization more than ever, more than we think and then we say.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. So, this is an embarrassment of riches, given that, we've got 3 former foreign ministers and a former education minister. I have to close, unfortunately, even though I'd love to listen to you for the rest of the evening. And so I don't know whether you'll be able to do this, but in one word, okay? My final question to you is this: if you were president of the world, given your proximity to power, your past proximity to power, if you were president of the world, what is the one thing you would do to ensure that we are better prepared for the next pandemic? I'll start with you, Anna.
With me? I mean...
one word, one thing you would do to make sure we're better prepared.
It's utopian, so I would not know what to do. But if I had all the power of the world, which is different, I would ask for information, that everybody puts forward honest and complete information, and that we have protocols and we have for the next pandemic.
Okay, thank you very much. Hubert, si c'est possible, just one word.
Le son n'est pas...
Well, I couldn't hear you.
Okay, my question was, if you were president of the world, given your past proximity to power, you've been a foreign minister, if you were president of the world, what is the one thing you would do to ensure we're better prepared for the next pandemic? Very brief, because we're out of time.
J'espère bien qu'il n'y aura jamais de président du monde.
I hope there will never be a president of the world, because if he is a bad one, a poor one, where would go? Would go to the moon to escape him or her? No. In jest. I did say that at the beginning, of course, to answer the question. First, we need to really draw the best lessons. We have to draw the good practices. Quite obviously, the globalization will continue, but it will be corrected, amended, modified for rational and economic and ecological reasons. Well, we have to draw the best lessons to be able to continue on better. Merci.
Okay, thank you. I will give the Obi. The one thing you would do to ensure that we're better prepared for the next pandemic?
I would put young people and women from around the world and give them the pencil or the pen with which to redesign our multilateral order. Because I know that between these two groups, we will get something that is sensible for action, not something that's based on political rhetorics.
Well, that's quite powerful. And the final word goes to you, Paulo. The one thing that you would do, the one word, to make it sure that we're better prepared for the next pandemic.
Rationality. Rational decisions. And connaissance et expérience.
Knowledge and experience. But I would like to also add an ironic quote-unquote detail. The only person for whom I would vote as the world's president would be Queen Elizabeth. This is the duty. This is the embodiment of the duty.
Ceremonial.
Paulo is too much of a traditionalist.
I think he's being cheeky.
I think we need the world that responds to the needs of the young and the women. We had enough of people like Paulo.
Young people love her.
And his generation. We had enough of you. Goodbye.
I thought we were finishing, but we're starting again. Look, this has been such a fascinating conversation, and it's been made even richer just by the wealth of insights you all bring from your vast backgrounds and your intellectual capacity. I've enjoyed listening to you. I would love to continue, but unfortunately we're out of time. My hope is that this sets the standard for the rest of the conversations to come with this Atlantic Dialogue's 10th edition. So I'd like to thank you all. Madam Ana Palacio, former Foreign Minister of Spain, Paulo, former Foreign Minister of Portugal, Hubert Védrine, former Foreign Minister of France, and last but not least, representing Africa against 3 Europeans, Obi Ezekwesili, former Education Minister in Nigeria. You've all been extremely generous with your insights and extraordinary, and I thank you. It's been a pleasure moderating you. And I'd like to thank the Policy Center for bringing this on, even with the challenges of COVID. My name is Udwa Kamimo. Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Goodbye.